Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Ukraine is only one part of Vladimir Putin's long-term plans. The Russian president is also eager to extend his tendrils of power into the South Caucasus region, expanding his influence in nations like Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. Unfortunately for him, things aren't quite going to plan, and they just got much worse. In fact, Azerbaijan has effectively crushed Putin's South Caucasus project in a single move, sending a major message to the Kremlin and transforming the geopolitical future of this part of the world forevermore. For a long time, Russia enjoyed a great deal of power and influence across the South Caucasus countries, largely thanks to a long-running conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, which sits within Azerbaijani territory but was, for many years, inhabited almost entirely by Armenian people. This region has been the source of much dispute and bloodshed over the decades, dating all the way back to the early 1990s, when Armenian separatists living in the area declared independence and established their own republic, called the Republic of Artsakh, with a long-term objective to unite with Armenia, expanding Armenia's territory while taking land away from Azerbaijan. This republic was never recognized internationally, but Armenian forces intervened to help out the separatists, triggering the First Nagorno-Karabakh War between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which involved thousands of deaths and casualties for both sides. Russia never officially recognized the Republic of Artsakh either, but that didn't stop the Kremlin using the situation to its advantage, carefully playing both sides off against each other, serving as a mediator, arms supplier, and peacekeeper at various stages throughout the conflict. At times, it appeared to back the separatists, other times it seemed more in support of Azerbaijani sovereignty. No one knew exactly where the Kremlin stood, and that's exactly how Russia's leadership wanted it to be. By striking a delicate balance and effectively aiding both sides, it managed to maintain connections with both countries, rather than having just one as an ally and the other as an enemy. The war eventually ended with an Armenian victory, with over 700,000 Azerbaijanis being expelled from Armenia, as well as Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding territories, with the Nagorno-Karabakh region entering a state of legal limbo. It was never officially recognized by the international community, but essentially operated as an extension of Armenia. Russia managed to play a large part in brokering the 1994 ceasefire that brought the war to an end, maintaining strong, if sometimes fluctuating, ties with both countries for the decades that followed. In 2020, however, everything started to go south. That was the year that the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War broke out, when Azerbaijani forces, heavily backed by one of the country's closest allies, Turkey, launched a large-scale offensive to recapture lost lands, including the Nagorno-Karabakh region. With the aid of modern drones and other strong military assets, the Azeri forces soon asserted dominance and routed the Armenian separatists. Despite being closer to Armenia than Azerbaijan, Russia didn't immediately intervene to assist its closer ally. Instead, it once more attempted to play both sides, supplying both countries with weapons before eventually deploying some of its own peacekeeping troops along the lines of confrontation to avert a complete Armenian collapse. Azerbaijan still won the war, with Azeri forces taking over the majority of the so-called Republic of Artsakh's territory, and the Kremlin was again also responsible for brokering a peace deal to bring the conflict to a close. For a time, it seemed as though history was simply repeating itself, and that Russia would continue to maintain reasonably fair and friendly relations with both nations. Behind the scenes, however, Armenian officials were upset with the lack of Russian support during the Second War, while Azerbaijani officials equally weren't particularly pleased with Russia getting involved in the conflict towards its closing stages. Then, in September 2023, the situation deteriorated further. By that time, Russia was well and truly engaged in its war with Ukraine, which had continued for far longer than Moscow ever anticipated. Perhaps sensing an opportunity, Azerbaijan launched a rapid assault to take full control of the Nagorno-Karabakh region at last. Russian peacekeepers were stationed in the area at the time but didn't intervene. This strongly upset Armenia, which accused Russia of failing to uphold its security commitments and being too distracted with the war in Ukraine to assist an ally in need. Long-standing ties between the two countries began to fray, and the situation only worsened when it was agreed that Artsakh be officially dissolved. A mass exodus of Armenian people began, with more than 100 people started, hundreds of thousands fleeing Nagorno-Karabakh as the region returned to Azeri control. Russian peacekeepers were also ordered to leave, and even Armenia called for Russia to vacate the region, with Moscow's forces officially heading home in the spring of 2024. And as those soldiers left, so too did much of Russia's influence in the South Caucasus. Since then, feeling betrayed by Russia, Armenia has sought security guarantees from other nations, specifically seeking aid in the Western world, turning to the likes of the US and European Union members. Russia's relations with Azerbaijan have also become increasingly frosty as time has gone by. Baku has instead strengthened its bonds with Turkey and taken a more assertive and even aggressive stance towards Moscow, with the Azeri president Ilham Aliyev publicly sharing his support for Ukraine on more than one occasion. Back during the summer months, for example, he urged Kiev to never surrender to Russian aggression, stating, "I have only one piece of advice for you, Ukraine never agree to occupation, do not surrender." The situation took a particularly grave turn on December 26, 2024, when an Azeri civilian airplane flying from Baku to Grozny in Russia was shot accidentally by Russian air defenses. The Russian systems seemingly mistook the plane for a Ukrainian drone or some other enemy aircraft. The damaged plane managed to make an emergency landing in Kazakhstan, but out of 67 passengers on board when it departed Azerbaijan's capital, only 29 survived. According to reports from Azeri sources, the pilots of the plane wanted to carry out an emergency landing in Russia, but were refused permission to do so. Some analysts believe that this was part of a dark Russian plot to essentially force the plane to crash land in the Caspian Sea, potentially leaving no survivors and erasing any evidence of Russia's involvement in the incident. This, combined with the fact that Vladimir Putin has never openly accepted Russia's responsibility for this attack, or offered any kind of compensation to those affected, led to huge amounts of anger and resentment among the Azeri people, aimed directly at the Kremlin, with one Baku native named Layla telling Al Jazeera, "If the plane had been allowed to land in Russia after the mistake was realized, perhaps those lives could have been saved. Instead, the plane was sent to Kazakhstan, a decision made by heartless, incompetent individuals. This lack of humanity and accountability is what angers and devastates people the most." Azeri's leadership group, too, has expressed extreme frustration and outrage over Russia's unwillingness to admit fault and apologize for what happened, with President Aliyev repeatedly urging Moscow to admit its guilt over the incident. Since then, the situation has swiftly spiraled. First, Aliyev canceled various high-level official visits to Moscow and suspended bilateral commissions with the Kremlin. Azerbaijan also announced an end to Russian cultural events, and the country's state media suddenly became more openly critical of the Kremlin. In February of this year, Azerbaijan took things a step further, shutting down the Russian Information and Cultural Center in Baku, then closing the Azeri branch of Russia's Sputnik news agency. Aliyev also revealed he wouldn't be attending Moscow's May 9 victory parade, despite being invited by President Putin. In the summer, Moscow hit back. Russian special forces conducted a raid in the city of Yekaterinburg, specifically targeting ethnic Azeri people, with 2 of them being killed and numerous others being beaten, humiliated, and harshly treated. Azeri authorities responded with disgust and indignation, urging a full-scale investigation into the incident. Then, a pair of Russian journalists were arrested in Baku for fraud and money laundering, before more Russian citizens were also apprehended, allegedly for being involved in organized crime groups responsible for drug trafficking. Both countries continue to poke and prod at one another in a tit-for-tat battle that seemingly has no end in sight, with each response slightly more serious than the last. In August, the Kremlin massively escalated the situation when Russian forces targeted an Azeri energy facility in Ukraine. A few days after that, one of Russia's top TV propagandists, Vladimir Solovyov, suggested that the country could go to war with Azerbaijan at some stage in the foreseeable future. It is necessary to understand that what is happening in the South Caucasus is a very big problem, and soon the Caspian Sea could end up in a situation where NATO bases might appear there. This is so dangerous that, from a geopolitical perspective, it could lead to consequences where this might not be the last special military operation of our generation. Several other high-profile Russians shared similar sentiments, like Andrei Gurylyov, a Russian MP, who argued that Azerbaijani goods should be banned from import to the Russian Federation and Azeri people living in Russia should be shaken down. Gurylyov added that the special military operation is a wide concept and could apply to any nation on Russia's border, including Azerbaijan. Yuri Podolyaka, a well-known pro-Putin military blogger, agreed, stating that a war between Russia and Azerbaijan is becoming more than just a theoretical possibility. Clearly, these Kremlin cronies have been ordered to intimidate Azerbaijan, making open-ended threats and fueling fears among the Azeri population of a potential impending Russian invasion. But Azerbaijan's leadership isn't running scared. Instead, it's taking the best possible steps to defend itself, building bonds with the NATO alliance, and recently making a major announcement that will no doubt have sent Putin himself into a fit of rage behind his Kremlin desk. On November 6, Azeri President Ilham Aliyev revealed that Azerbaijan's army is officially and entirely transitioning to NATO standards. He made this announcement during a meeting in Baku, where regional security and the modernization of Azerbaijan's armed forces were 2 of the top topics on the agenda. Various NATO representatives were in attendance at the event, including some from Turkey, the United States, France, Greece, Hungary, and the Netherlands. According to reports, Aliyev emphasized Azerbaijan's commitment to remain a valuable NATO partner, highlighting his country's cooperation with Turkey to strengthen its defensive capabilities. The Azerbaijani army has been brought into line with NATO standards and cooperates closely with the Turkish army in this regard. Aliyev added that the army's modernization process is ongoing, with the ultimate aim of improving Azerbaijan's defense potential in the wake of the liberation of our lands from occupation. This is extremely bad news for Russia for 3 big reasons. First, and perhaps most worryingly from Putin's perspective, this move effectively brings NATO closer to Russia's borders. Azerbaijan isn't a NATO member, nor does it have any existing plans to join the alliance, but it has worked hard to be seen as a trusted partner for NATO nations to turn to and rely on. Azerbaijan joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program in 1994, for example, and established a diplomatic mission to NATO in 1997. It has participated in numerous NATO-led peacekeeping activities over the years in countries like Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, as well as providing cooperation in non-military areas like humanitarian and environmental aid. Russia sees NATO as its greatest enemy, and it's believed that part of the reason for the invasion of Ukraine was to eliminate any possibility of Kiev eventually joining the alliance, bringing NATO right to Russia's doorstep. In the end, Russia's move has monumentally backfired, as NATO nations have turned out to be some of the biggest providers of aid to Ukraine in the ongoing conflict, and the ties between Kiev and the alliance have never been closer. Now, by transitioning to NATO military standards, Azerbaijan is also quite clearly building major bonds with the alliance, while simultaneously turning its back on Russia. So, even though Baku isn't technically part of the alliance, the Kremlin will still feel as though NATO's shadow is looming just that little bit larger across its territory, not only from the west in Ukraine, but now also from the south in Azerbaijan. That will terrify Putin, as well as sending any plans he might have had about South Caucasus conquest up in smoke. Because now, if Russia were to launch some sort of invasion into Azerbaijan, it's highly likely that NATO nations would be just as willing to assist Baku as they have been in assisting Kiev. That would make it several times harder for Putin's forces to take control of any Azeri territories, which leads us neatly onto the second reason this is a very bad day for Russia. Azerbaijan's military modernization is most likely about to receive some serious upgrades. By switching to NATO standards, Azerbaijan's army is now in the perfect position to start receiving and using NATO weapons and defensive systems. That in turn means that countries like the US, Germany, France, and other NATO members could begin selling and supplying state-of-the-art armored vehicles, air defenses, rifles, artillery systems, rocket launchers, and more to Baku in the weeks and months to come, bringing the country's military into the modern era in one fell swoop. For reference, Azerbaijan is currently ranked 60th on Global Firepower's list of the world's most powerful military forces. But a large reason for that low ranking is the country's continued reliance on relatively old and outdated Soviet-era equipment. If it suddenly were able to upgrade and replace some of its Soviet relics with modern Western weapons, Azerbaijan could become a much more formidable force. Of course, it will likely never be able to have an army strong enough to rival Russia's, since it's a much smaller country, with a population of just over 10 million people, compared to the almost 144 million that call Russia home. But with stronger equipment in its arsenal, it would at least be able to put up more of a fight in the event of any sort of invasion or assault on its territory and sovereignty. And Russia is clearly fearful of Azerbaijan growing stronger. In a recent interview with a state-owned newspaper, two Russian military experts, Konstantin Sivkov and Yuri Nutov, shared their concerns. Sivkov worried that Baku was building up towards a full integration into the alliance. The transfer of the Azerbaijani armed forces to NATO standards means only one thing: Baku has embarked on integration into the North Atlantic Alliance. Meanwhile, Nutov expressed fears that Azerbaijan was attempting to oust Russia from the Transcaucasia region entirely. He also shared his belief that Baku will now begin buying Western weapons and military equipment, and that Azerbaijan's armed forces will completely reorganize themselves to align with other NATO nations, before suggesting that the Azerbaijani armed forces will become an appendage of the Turkish army. The increasingly solid connections between Azerbaijan and Turkey are the third and final piece of bad news for Russia. Russia has always kept its old Soviet partners close, exerting power and influence across a whole collection of countries along its borders. And as one of those old Soviet republics, Azerbaijan has historically seen Russia as its closest and most important ally. Time and again throughout history, it has turned to Moscow in its hours of need, relying on the Kremlin for support, security, and trade. It still does to an extent. Despite increasingly frosty and thorny relations between the two countries, the Azeri president did recently sit down with Putin at a meeting in Tajikistan in October, and Azerbaijan knows it cannot cut ties with Russia entirely. Moscow is still one of its most significant economic partners, and Azerbaijan controls a key transit link between Russia and Iran. The international north-south transport corridor so clearly benefits from avoiding any sort of open conflict with either of the nations to its north and south. At the same time, unlike some of the other former Soviet republics that continue to rely almost exclusively on Russia to survive, Azerbaijan is broadening its horizons and actively expanding its network, forging new friendships with the likes of Turkey to open up new opportunities for trade. Defense and mutual cooperation, the stronger those bonds become, the less reliant Baku will be on Moscow, and right now facing an economic crisis and countless additional large-scale problems brought on by the war in Ukraine, Russia cannot afford those kinds of losses. It needs dependent countries like Azerbaijan that will continue to provide it with migrants for the front lines and resources for the war machine. But Azerbaijan is standing up and saying no. It's taking its destiny into its own hands, strengthening its standing on the global stage, and refusing to be bullied by Russia any longer. As Emil Avdaliani, an international relations expert writing for the Center for European Policy Analysis, puts it, Azerbaijan considers itself a significant regional power better off when it is free of the Kremlin's policy shackles, and there's not much Russia can do about it. What's more, as Azerbaijan inevitably grows stronger and more independent, other countries in similar positions might start asking themselves, why can't we do the same? If that happens, Russia may lose even more of its closest allies and far more of its influence across Asia, Europe, and beyond. You can learn more about how Putin's carefully constructed empire of dependent nations and puppet regimes is slowly falling apart at the seams in this video. Or check out this video to discover how even one of the Kremlin's own officials is no longer capable of sugarcoating the situation, predicting political chaos, unrest, and even the possibility of civil war for Russia in 2026. Be sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay in the know and up to date on everything related to the Russia-Ukraine war and other major military conflicts around the world.